Commander Zexhai felt the cold metal floor against his face as consciousness slowly returned to him. His head pounded with a sharp pain that seemed to echo through his entire body. The lights in his ship's bridge flickered weakly above him, casting strange shadows on the walls. He tried to move but found his arms and legs heavy and unresponsive. Something was very wrong. The last thing he remembered was meeting with his senior officers in the command room. They had been discussing the new trade agreements with the human colonies, and Zexhai had been excited about the possibilities. His people, the Catherians, had always been warriors, but he believed that peace and cooperation would make them stronger. The humans had shown remarkable ingenuity and resilience in their short time among the stars, and Zexhai thought both species could learn from each other, but his officers had not shared his enthusiasm. Captain Velinor had spoken with barely hidden anger about the shame of working with humans. Commander Thexul had called the trade deals a betrayal of their ancestors. Even his trusted friend, Lieutenant Kexmore, had looked at him with disappointment and disgust. Zexhai had tried to reason with them, to explain that strength came in many forms, not just through conquest and domination. That was when everything went dark. Now, as he struggled to sit up, Zexhai realized what had happened. His own crew had turned against him. They had drugged him, and while he was unconscious, they had done something to his ship. The emergency lights told him that main power was failing. The air felt thin and stale, which meant life support was compromised. The gentle hum of the engines was gone, replaced by an ominous silence that meant they were drifting in space. Zexhai forced himself to stand on shaking legs. His crystalline skin, normally bright with bioluminescent patterns, was dim and gray. The intricate designs that covered his 8-foot frame flickered weakly, reflecting his weakened state. He made his way to the main control panel, his clawed hands trembling as he tried to access the ship's systems. The damage was extensive and deliberate. The engines had been completely disabled, their power cores disconnected and removed. The communication array had been destroyed beyond repair, its components scattered across the floor of the communications bay. Most critically, the life support system had been sabotaged to fail slowly over the course of several days. His crew had not wanted him to die quickly. They wanted him to suffer, to think about his supposed crimes as the air ran out and the cold of space crept in. The navigation computers still functioned, and Zexhai checked their current position. They were in the outer reaches of the Centauri system, far from any major shipping routes or planetary colonies. His crew had chosen this location carefully, ensuring that no one would find him before it was too late. According to the computers' calculations, he had perhaps 3 days of breathable air remaining, maybe 4 if he was careful with his movements and stayed calm. Zexhai slumped into his command chair and tried to process what had happened. He had known that his views were unpopular among many Catherians, but he had never imagined that his own officers would resort to murder. The traditional honor code of his people demanded that disputes be settled in open combat, not through treachery and betrayal. By abandoning him in space, they had violated every principle their society claimed to uphold. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent years arguing that humans were not the savage barbarians that Catherian propaganda portrayed them as. He had studied their history, their literature, their art, and had found a species capable of great compassion and nobility. Now, as he drifted toward human space in a dying ship, it was his own people who had proven themselves capable of the worst kind of cruelty. As the hours passed, Zexhai tried to find some way to restore power to his ship's engines or communications. He crawled through access tunnels and maintenance shafts, following power conduits and checking relay stations. But his crew had been thorough in their sabotage. Every critical component had been damaged or removed. Even if he had weeks instead of days, he would not have been able to repair the ship with the tools and spare parts available to him. The temperature inside the ship continued to drop as the heating system struggled with failing power. Zexhai wrapped himself in an emergency blanket, but it provided little comfort. His breath began to form small clouds in the air, and frost started to accumulate on the metal surfaces around him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of metal contracting in the cold. and the quiet hiss of air slowly leaking from damaged seals. Zexhai thought about his family back on the Catherian homeworld. His mate, Zalitha, had supported his work with the humans, understanding that their daughter would inherit a galaxy where cooperation was more valuable than conquest. His young child, Kexara, had listened with wide eyes as he told stories of human ingenuity and determination. They would never know what had really happened to him. The official reports would probably claim that he had died in an accident or been killed by human pirates. As his second day alone began, Zexhai made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of spending his remaining time in despair, he would use it productively. He began recording detailed logs of everything he knew about the conspiracy against him. He named the officers involved, described their plans, and explained their motivations. If his body was ever found, these records might serve as evidence of their crimes. More importantly, he began to compile everything he knew about the growing anti-human sentiment within the Catherian military. There were factions that wanted to launch a preemptive strike against human colonies, believing that it was better to destroy them now before they became too powerful. Zexhai had been working to oppose these plans, but his removal from the scene would make it much easier for the Warhawks to get their way. He recorded detailed information about Catherian military capabilities, fleet positions, and strategic planning. If these records somehow made it into human hands, they might provide the intelligence needed to defend against the coming attack. It was a long shot, but it was the only meaningful thing he could do with his remaining time. On his third day, as the air grew thin and his movements became sluggish, Zexhai made one final adjustment to his ship's course. He programmed the navigation computer to direct the vessel toward the human colony of New Geneva, one of the outer settlements that maintained regular contact with Earth. It was still a remote chance that anyone would find him, but if they did, at least his ship would be in friendly territory. The life support system gave its final warning as Zexhai settled back into his command chair. The oxygen level had dropped below sustainable levels, and carbon dioxide was building up in the recycled air. His vision began to blur, and his thoughts became confused and scattered. As consciousness faded, his last coherent thought was a prayer to the ancient spirits of his people, asking not for rescue, but for his sacrifice to have meaning. The ship continued its silent drift through the void, carrying its dying passenger toward an uncertain fate among the stars. Captain Jake Morrison stretched in his command chair as he watched the stars drift past on the main view screen. The cargo hauler New Frontier was 3 days into what should have been a routine supply run to the mining stations around Proxima Centauri. The ship carried food supplies, medical equipment, and replacement parts for the mining operations that kept the outer colonies supplied with rare metals and minerals. It was boring work, but it paid well and kept his crew employed. Jake had served 15 years in the Earth Defense Force before retiring to the Merchant Marine. The transition from military precision to civilian cargo hauling had taken some adjustment, but he had grown to appreciate the freedom and independence that came with running his own ship. The New Frontier was his pride and joy, a converted military transport that he had purchased at surplus auction and modified for civilian use. His crew of 12 were all former military personnel who had chosen the civilian life for various reasons. Some were tired of taking orders from bureaucrats who had never seen real combat. Others wanted the chance to make some decent money without having to follow military regulations. A few, like Jake himself, had simply grown weary of the constant preparation for wars that might never come. Lieutenant Amy Foster sat at the sensor station, methodically scanning space ahead of their course. She had been Jake's weapons officer during the last pirate conflict, and her sharp eyes and quick reflexes had saved their lives more times than Jake cared to count. Now she used those same skills to watch for hazards to navigation and potential salvage opportunities. Amy was focused on her displays when something unusual caught her attention. A faint energy signature appeared on the long-range sensors, barely detectable at the edge of their scanning range. The pattern was unlike anything in their computer databases, with power fluctuations and energy emissions that did not match any known human or alien. Technology. She adjusted the sensor array to get a clearer reading and felt her pulse quicken as the data came into focus. The signature was definitely artificial, probably a spacecraft of some kind, but it was not broadcasting any identification signals or distress calls. More concerning, the energy levels were dropping steadily, suggesting that whatever it was had serious problems. Jake Morrison had been watching Amy work and noticed the change in her posture. After years of serving together, he could read his crew's body language like an open book. When Amy got that particular look of concentration, it usually meant something interesting was about to happen. He left his command chair and walked over to her station to see what had captured her attention. The tactical display showed a three-dimensional representation of local space, with their ship represented by a blue triangle moving steadily toward their destination. The unknown contact appeared as a red dot roughly 2 days' travel off their current course. As Jake watched, the computer updated the contact's status, showing continued power loss and erratic movement patterns. Amy looked up at her captain with concern evident in her voice. The unknown vessel was clearly in distress, but its alien origin presented a significant complication. First contact protocols required that any encounter with non-human intelligence be reported immediately to Earth Defense Command, but the bureaucratic process could take weeks or even months. If there were survivors aboard that ship, they would be long dead before any official help arrived. Chief Engineer Ben Parker emerged from the lower decks at that moment, drawn by the unusual activity on the bridge. Ben was a short, stocky man with grease-stained coveralls and an encyclopedic knowledge of spacecraft systems. He had kept the New Frontier running through more crises than Jake could remember, often performing miracles with spare parts and improvised solutions. Ben studied the sensor data with professional interest. He pointed out that the power signature was consistent with a vessel losing atmosphere and experiencing cascade system failures. The energy pattern suggested that whatever was powering the ship was designed very differently from human technology, but the basic principles of life support and propulsion seemed similar enough that he could make educated guesses about the ship's condition. Jake felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. The decision he made in the next few minutes could affect the lives of his crew and potentially change the course of human-alien relations. The safe choice would be to report the contact and continue on their scheduled route. But safety had never been Jake's primary concern when lives were at stake. The captain called for a crew meeting in the main cargo bay. Within minutes, all 12 members of his team had gathered around him. Jake explained the situation clearly and honestly, outlining both the risks and the potential rewards of attempting a rescue mission. The alien ship was far enough off course that reaching it would require a significant detour and delay their scheduled deliveries. More seriously, they had no idea what they might find aboard the vessel or how its occupants might react to human contact. Dr. Karen Wells, the ship's medic, was the first to speak up. She had joined the crew after completing her residency at the medical center on Mars, seeking adventure and the chance to practice medicine in challenging conditions. The possibility of treating an alien patient presented both exciting opportunities and terrifying unknowns. She had no idea what kind of physiology they might encounter, or whether her medical knowledge would be applicable to non-human biology. Sergeant Lisa Stone, their security chief, voiced the concerns that everyone was thinking. As a former Marine, she was trained to expect the worst and prepare for every possible threat. An alien vessel could be anything from a peaceful exploration ship to a military scout or even a trap designed to lure human ships into danger. Without more information about the aliens' capabilities and intentions, they would be taking enormous risks. But the discussion kept coming back to one fundamental question that defined who they were as human beings. If there were sentient creatures dying aboard that ship, could they simply ignore the situation and continue about their business? Every member of the crew had sworn an oath during their military service to protect innocent life wherever they found it. The fact that the potential victims were aliens did not change the moral equation. Jake made his decision with the full support of his crew. They would alter course to intercept the alien vessel and attempt a rescue operation. The new Frontier's engines were pushed to maximum sustainable velocity as they raced toward the unknown contact. Ben worked around the clock to ensure that their ship's systems were operating at peak efficiency, while Karen prepared the medical bay for treating patients with unknown physiological requirements. As they drew closer to the alien ship, the sensor readings became more detailed and more alarming. The vessel was losing atmosphere through multiple hull breaches, and its power core was operating at barely 10% of normal capacity. Internal temperature had dropped well below the range that most known life forms could tolerate. If there were survivors aboard, they were probably unconscious and close to death. Amy coordinated with Ben to prepare for the delicate process of matching courses and docking with a vessel that was tumbling slowly through space. The alien ship's design was unlike anything they had ever seen, with organic curves and crystalline structures that seemed to grow from the hull rather than being assembled from separate components. The docking ports, if they existed, were not immediately obvious from their external scans. Jake suited up in full environmental gear and prepared to lead the boarding party personally. As captain, he could have ordered someone else to take the risk, but his military training and personal code of honor would not allow him to send his people into danger while he remained safely aboard his own ship. Lisa and Amy would accompany him, while the rest of the crew maintained position and monitored communications. The final approach required careful maneuvering to match the alien ship's rotation and drift. Ben used the new Frontier's docking thrusters with surgical precision to bring them alongside the unknown vessel without causing additional damage to its weakened hull. The process took nearly an hour of patient work, but eventually they were able to establish a stable connection between the two ships. Jake's hands were steady as he cycled through the airlock, but his heart was pounding with anticipation and concern. In the next few minutes, humanity would make first contact with an alien species under circumstances that none of the diplomatic training manuals had ever considered. Whatever they found aboard that ship would change everything, not just for his crew, but potentially for all of human civilization. The airlock sealed behind them with a soft hiss, and Jake led his team into the unknown depths of the alien vessel. The corridor beyond was dimly lit by failing bioluminescent panels, casting strange shadows on walls that curved and flowed like living tissue. The air was thin and cold, barely breathable even with their environmental suits. Somewhere in the maze of passages ahead, they hoped to find answers to questions that humanity had been asking since first looking up at the stars. The interior of the alien ship was unlike anything Jake Morrison had ever seen. The corridors curved and twisted in ways that seemed to follow no human logic, with walls that appeared to be grown rather than built. Strange symbols glowed weakly along the passages, their meaning completely foreign to the three humans who carefully made their way deeper into the vessel. The air was thin and cold, and their breath formed small clouds even inside their environmental suits. Amy Foster held her scanner in front of her as they moved through the ship, trying to map the layout and locate any signs of life. The readings were confusing because the alien technology operated on principles that her instruments were not designed to understand. Energy flowed through the walls themselves in patterns that seemed organic rather than mechanical. The ship felt more like exploring inside a living creature than boarding a manufactured vessel. Lisa Stone kept her weapon ready, but not threatening as she watched for any signs of movement or danger. Her military training told her to expect the unexpected, but nothing had prepared her for the strangeness of this environment. The passages were clearly designed for beings much larger than humans, with doorways that rose nearly 10 feet high and corridors wide enough for several people to walk side by side. They followed Amy's scanner readings toward what appeared to be the strongest life sign signature. The path led them through several chambers filled with equipment that defied easy explanation. Crystalline structures pulsed with fading light, connected by networks of what looked like metallic vines. Control surfaces responded to their presence by glowing more brightly, as if the ship itself was aware of their intrusion. The bridge of the alien vessel was a vast, circular chamber with a raised platform in the center. Displays covered the walls from floor to ceiling, showing star charts and navigational data in symbols that hurt to look at directly. But it was not the technology that captured their attention. It was the figure collapsed near the central command station. The alien was enormous, easily 8 feet tall even while lying on his side. His skin appeared to be made of some kind of living crystal that reflected their helmet lights in prismatic patterns. Intricate designs covered his entire body, flowing from his head down to his feet in patterns that seemed both decorative and functional. The designs were dim now, flickering weakly like dying embers. But Jake could imagine how magnificent they must have appeared when the creature was healthy. Amy immediately began scanning the alien with her medical equipment, trying to understand his basic physiology. The readings were unlike anything in her database, but she could detect what appeared to be brain activity and some kind of circulatory system. The creature was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and his body temperature was far below what seemed normal for his species. Jake approached the alien carefully, not wanting to startle him if he regained consciousness. Up close, he could see that the crystalline skin was actually quite beautiful, with layers of translucent material that created depth and complexity in the patterns. The alien's face was roughly humanoid but longer and more angular, with large eyes that were currently closed. His hands ended in what appeared to be natural claws, but they seemed designed for fine manipulation rather than combat. As if sensing their presence, the alien's eyes fluttered open. They were large and multifaceted like jewels, reflecting their lights in dozens of tiny images. For a moment, confusion and fear flickered across the alien's features as he tried to focus on the 3 humans standing over him. Jake could only imagine what he must be thinking, waking up to find strange creatures in environmental suits examining him. The alien tried to speak, but only managed a series of harmonic tones that their universal translators could not interpret. The sounds were hauntingly beautiful, like music played on instruments that did not exist on Earth. Jake removed his helmet, knowing it was risky but wanting to show that he meant no harm. The air in the ship was barely breathable, thin, and cold. But he could survive for a few minutes without life support. Jake spoke slowly and clearly, using simple words and gestures to try to communicate peaceful intentions. He pointed to himself and said his name, then gestured to Amy and Lisa to introduce them as well. The alien watched with obvious intelligence, his jeweled eyes tracking their movements and expressions. When Jake offered him water from his emergency supply, the alien accepted it gratefully. Though he could only manage small sips, Amy worked to prepare the alien for transport to their ship. His size and weight made the process complicated, but Lisa had brought a portable stretcher system designed for moving injured personnel in zero gravity. They had to modify it to accommodate the alien's larger frame and different body proportions. Throughout the process, the alien remained conscious but weak, watching everything they did with what seemed like wonder and gratitude. The journey back to the new frontier required careful coordination between the boarding party and Ben Parker's engineering team. The alien's weight pushed their equipment to its limits, and they had to move slowly to avoid causing him additional injury. Jake stayed with the alien throughout the transfer, maintaining eye contact and speaking in soothing tones even though he knew the creature could not understand his words. Dr. Karen Wells had spent the time preparing the medical bay for a patient unlike any she had ever treated. She had cleared the largest treatment room and assembled every piece of diagnostic equipment the ship carried. Her medical training had covered treating humans in extreme environments, but there was no textbook for alien physiology. She would have to rely on basic biological principles and careful observation. To keep her patient alive, the alien's arrival in the medical bay created a flurry of activity. As Karen began her examination, his vital signs were unlike anything in her database, but she could detect patterns that suggested basic biological functions. His breathing was labored but steady, and his body temperature was slowly rising now that he was in a heated environment. The crystalline patterns on his skin began to glow more brightly as his condition improved. Ben Parker joined them in the medical bay to study the alien's physiology from an engineering perspective. He was fascinated by the way the creature's body seemed to integrate biological and technological elements. The patterns on his skin appeared to serve multiple functions, acting as both decoration and as some kind of biological circuitry. Ben theorized that the alien's entire species might have evolved to interface directly with their technology. Over the following hours, Jake and his crew worked tirelessly to understand their patient's needs. They analyzed samples of his breath to determine what kind of atmosphere he required. They studied his reactions to different foods and liquids to understand his nutritional requirements. Most importantly, they used every method they could think of to establish basic communication. The breakthrough came when Amy discovered that the alien responded to mathematical concepts. She drew simple equations on a tablet and showed them to him, and his eyes lit up with recognition. He gestured for the tablet and began drawing symbols of his own, showing mathematical relationships that were universal regardless of species or culture. Through this method, they were able to establish basic concepts like numbers, time, and distance. Jake spent long hours sitting beside the alien's bed, working on expanding their communication. He learned that the creature's name was something like Zexhai, though the exact pronunciation was difficult for human vocal cords. In return, Zexhai learned to recognize the humans by name and began to understand basic English words. The process was slow and frustrating, but both sides were motivated by curiosity and gratitude. As Zexhai's strength returned, he became more animated in his communications. He drew star charts that showed the location of his homeworld and traced the route that had brought him to this region of space. More concerning, he drew pictures that seemed to show conflict between his people and humans. The images suggested that not all of his species shared his apparent friendliness toward humanity. Karen monitored Zexhai's recovery with scientific fascination and growing concern. His physiology was remarkably resilient and he was healing faster than she had expected. But there were aspects of his biology that suggested he was designed for a much different environment than the one aboard their ship. She worried about long-term compatibility issues and the possibility that he might need medical care that was beyond their capabilities. The crew of the New Frontier found themselves facing a decision that would affect the rest of their lives. They had saved Zexhai from certain death, but now they had to figure out what to do with him. They could not simply return him to his own people without understanding the political situation that had led to his abandonment. At the same time, keeping him aboard their ship indefinitely was not a viable long-term solution. Jake made the decision to alter course for Earth, where Zexhai could receive proper medical care and where diplomatic experts could handle the first contact situation properly. It would mean abandoning their current cargo run and potentially facing serious consequences from their corporate employers. But Jake had never been one to choose profit over principles, and his crew supported him completely in this decision. The breakthrough in communication came on the 5th day after Zexhai's rescue. Dr. Karen Wells had been monitoring his brain activity while he slept and noticed unusual patterns in his neural responses when she played recordings of human speech. Near his resting area, certain regions of his brain showed increased activity even while he was unconscious. This suggested that his species might have an innate ability to process and learn new languages at an accelerated rate. Jake Morrison decided to test this theory by spending several hours each day in focused conversation with Zexhai. He would speak slowly and clearly about simple topics, using pictures and gestures to reinforce the meaning of his words. To everyone's amazement, Zexhai began to respond in broken but recognizable English within just 2 days of this intensive training. The first complete sentence that Zexhai spoke in English was both touching and alarming. He looked directly at Jake and said in halting words that his own people had tried to kill him because he believed humans were not enemies. The simple statement carried enormous implications for both species, suggesting that there were political factions among the aliens that viewed humanity as a threat to be eliminated. As Zexhai's language skills improved, the full scope of his situation became clear. He was not just any Catherian officer, but a high-ranking commander who had been involved in strategic planning for his entire species. His progressive views about cooperation with humans had made him powerful enemies within his own military. Hierarchy. The attempt on his life had been carefully planned by a group of traditionalist officers who saw his influence as dangerous to their culture. Zex single quotes HAI explained that his people called themselves the Catherian Republic, though the government was dominated by military leaders who believed that conquest was the only path to security and prosperity. For generations, they had expanded their territory by absorbing weaker species and enslaving those who could not defend themselves. The emergence of humanity as a spacefaring civilization had created a new challenge that many Catherians preferred. To solve through warfare rather than diplomacy, the alien commander described his species' capabilities in terms that made Jake's blood run cold. The Catherians possessed advanced weapons technology, faster-than-light travel, and a military tradition that had been refined through centuries of successful conquest. Their ships were larger and more powerful than anything in the human fleet, and their soldiers were trained from birth to view combat as the highest form of honor. More disturbing was Zexai's revelation that the faction opposed to human Catherian cooperation was already making preparations for war. They had been gathering intelligence about human colonies, mapping defensive installations, and calculating the force required to eliminate humanity as a potential rival. The attack would likely come within the next few months, time to catch human forces off guard and unprepared. Jake realized that they were carrying intelligence that could save millions of human lives, but getting that information to Earth Defense Command would require them to make difficult choices. Their current course would take them through several star systems where Catherian patrol ships were known to operate. If they were discovered carrying Zexai, they would likely be destroyed before they could deliver their warning. The crew held another meeting to discuss their options, this time with Zexai participating as much as his limited English would allow. The alien commander made it clear that he understood the risks they were taking on his behalf. He offered to surrender himself to any Catherian patrol they encountered, hoping that his sacrifice might allow the humans to escape with the vital intelligence about the coming attack. Jake rejected this suggestion immediately, both because it would mean abandoning someone who had become a friend and because Zexai's knowledge was too valuable to lose. Instead, they decided to take a longer route through less traveled regions of space, even though it would add weeks to their journey and strain their supplies. The delay was frustrating, but it was better than risking capture by hostile forces. During the long journey, Zexai worked tirelessly to share everything he knew about Catherian military capabilities and strategic thinking. He drew detailed diagrams of their ship designs, explained their tactical doctrines, and described the locations of major military installations. Amy Foster recorded everything, creating a comprehensive database that would be invaluable to human defense planners. Ben Parker was particularly interested in the technical aspects of Catherian technology. Zexai explained that his people had developed their sciences along biological lines, creating ships and weapons that grew rather than being manufactured. This approach gave them certain advantages in terms of self-repair and adaptation, but it also created potential vulnerabilities that human engineers might be able to exploit. Dr. Karen Wells continued to study Zexai's physiology, both to ensure his continued health and to understand the capabilities of his species. She discovered that Catherians were remarkably resilient, with redundant biological systems that allowed them to survive injuries that would be fatal to humans. However, they were also dependent on specific environmental conditions and dietary requirements that might limit their effectiveness in prolonged campaigns far from their homeworld. The most valuable intelligence that Zexai provided was psychological rather than technical. He explained the honor-based culture that drove Catherian decision-making and the internal political divisions that might be exploited to prevent or delay the planned attack. Not all Catherians supported the war faction, but they were constrained by social traditions that made it difficult to oppose established authority. Zexai also shared his personal observations about human behavior that had led him to advocate for peaceful relations. He had studied human history and had been impressed by humanity's capacity for innovation under pressure, and their ability to cooperate despite individual differences. He believed that these qualities made humans potentially valuable allies rather than just another species to be conquered. As their journey continued, the relationship between Zexhai and the human crew deepened beyond mere cooperation. The alien commander proved to have a dry sense of humor that translated surprisingly well across species barriers. He was fascinated by human concepts of individual rights and democratic decision-making, which were completely foreign to Cytherian society. Jake found himself spending hours in philosophical discussions with Zexhai about the differences between their species and cultures. The alien was particularly intrigued by the human tendency to question authority and challenge established traditions. In Cytherian society, such behavior was considered not just disrespectful, but actually dangerous to the stability of their civilization. The crew also learned about Zexhai's personal life and the family he had left behind on the Cytherian homeworld. He spoke with obvious affection about his mate and young offspring, expressing concern about their safety now that he had been branded as a traitor. Jake assured him that once the political situation was resolved, there might be ways to reunite him with his loved ones. Lisa Stone worked with Zexhai to understand Cytherian military tactics and combat techniques. Despite his progressive political views, Zexhai was still a warrior with extensive combat experience. He demonstrated fighting methods that were both elegant and devastatingly effective, adapted to the Cytherian size and natural advantages. This knowledge would be crucial for training human forces to face Cytherian soldiers in battle. The most difficult moment of their journey came when they detected a Cytherian patrol squadron operating near their planned route. The enemy ships were conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of human shipping lanes, gathering intelligence for the coming attack. Jake had to make a split-second decision about whether to engage them or try to avoid detection. Zexhai provided crucial assistance by explaining Cytherian communication protocols and sensor capabilities. He helped them modify their ship's energy signature to appear more like a standard cargo vessel and coached Amy on how to respond to any challenges from the patrol ships. The deception worked, but it was a tense few hours as they passed within scanning range of the enemy forces. The encounter reinforced how precarious their situation truly was and how important it was to reach Earth with Zexhai's intelligence. Every day of delay meant that the Cytherian war machine was moving closer to launching its attack on unsuspecting human colonies. The crew pushed their engines harder and rationed their supplies more strictly, knowing that speed might mean the difference between warning and catastrophe. As they finally approached the outer boundaries of human space, Zexhai grew more quiet and thoughtful. He understood that his arrival on Earth would mark the end of one phase of his life and the beginning of something completely unknown. He had betrayed his own species to prevent a war, but there was no guarantee that humans would trust him or that his information would be believed. Jake assured him that he would personally vouch for Zexhai's character and the validity of his warnings. The bond that had formed between them during their weeks together was stronger than mere tactical cooperation. Jake had come to see Zexhai as a being of genuine courage and honor, someone who had risked everything to do what he believed was right. The approach to Earth required careful planning and coordination with authorities who had never dealt with a situation like this before. Jake Morrison sent coded transmissions ahead of their arrival, trying to prepare Earth Defense Command for what they were bringing without revealing too much information over potentially monitored channels. The messages were deliberately vague, mentioning only that they carried urgent intelligence about alien intentions and requesting immediate diplomatic protection upon arrival. Admiral Patricia Hayes, commander of the Sol Defense Fleet, received Jake's transmissions with a mixture of skepticism and concern. The New Frontier was known as a reliable cargo hauler with a clean record, but the claims being made seemed almost impossible to believe. First contact with an alien species was supposed to happen under controlled conditions with proper diplomatic protocols, not as a rescue mission by a civilian cargo ship. Nevertheless, Hayes ordered a full escort squadron to meet the New Frontier at the edge of the solar system. If the situation was as serious as Jake claimed, then Earth needed to be prepared for whatever consequences might follow. The escort ships were instructed to provide protection while maintaining a safe distance, since no one knew what kind of alien pathogens or technologies might be involved. HFY spent the final weeks of their journey working intensively with the crew to prepare for his arrival on Earth. He practiced his English constantly, knowing that clear communication would be essential for convincing human authorities of the threat his people posed. Jake helped him understand human political structures and decision-making processes, which were radically different from the hierarchical systems he was familiar with. The alien commander also worked to compile and organize all of his intelligence about Catherian military capabilities. Amy Foster helped him create detailed charts showing fleet positions, supply lines, and potential attack routes. Ben Parker assisted with technical diagrams of Catherian weapons and defensive systems. Dr. Karen Wells documented everything she had learned about Catherian physiology and biology. As they drew closer to Earth, HFY became increasingly anxious about the reception he might receive. He understood that many humans would view him with suspicion or fear, seeing him as a potential spy or enemy agent rather than as someone trying to prevent a war. Jake assured him repeatedly that there were humans who would listen to reason and judge him by his actions rather than his species. The reunion with the escort squadron was both impressive and intimidating. 3 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers moved into formation around the new frontier, their weapons powered but not targeted. Jake could see the tension in his crew as they were surrounded by military vessels. Even though they knew the ships were there for protection rather than threat, Admiral Hayes herself came aboard the new frontier for the initial contact with HFY. She was a veteran officer with decades of experience in military planning and diplomacy, but even she was not fully prepared for meeting an 8-foot-tall alien warrior, whose crystalline skin cast rainbow patterns across the walls of the ship. Her first impression was one of awe at the sheer presence and dignity that HFY projected even in his weakened condition. The preliminary discussions took place in the New Frontier's main conference room, with Jake serving as an informal translator and cultural interpreter. HFY spoke slowly and carefully in his still developing English, explaining the political situation within the Catherian Republic and the growing momentum toward war with humanity. Admiral Hayes listened with professional skepticism, but the level of detail in HFY's intelligence made it clear that he was either telling the truth or was part of an incredibly sophisticated deception. The journey to Earth took an additional 3 days under escort, during which HFY underwent extensive debriefing sessions with military intelligence officers who had been brought aboard the escort vessels. Each conversation revealed new layers of information about Catherian society, technology, and strategic planning. The intelligence analysts were amazed by the depth and accuracy of the information they were receiving. Dr. Karen Wells worked closely with a team of xenobiologists and medical specialists who had been assembled to study HFY's physiology. They were fascinated by the integration of biological and technological elements in his body, and by the rapid healing abilities that had allowed him to recover from near death so quickly. The medical data would be crucial for understanding how to treat wounded Catherians and potentially how to develop countermeasures against their biological advantages. The approach to Earth itself was a moment of profound emotion for everyone involved. Jake and his crew had spent their entire lives among the stars, but seeing their home planet from space never lost its impact. For HFY, it was his first glimpse of the world that had produced a species he had risked everything to protect. The blue and white marble hanging in the blackness of space seemed almost fragile compared to the massive ships that guarded it. The New Frontier was directed to a secure orbital facility where HFY could be properly housed and protected, while the diplomatic and intelligence communities decided how to respond to the information he had provided. The facility had been hastily modified to accommodate his size and environmental needs, with the help of the detailed biological data that Dr. Wells had compiled during their journey. Jake insisted on remaining with HFY during the initial phases of his debriefing, serving as both translator and advocate. The bond that had formed between them during their weeks together had grown into a genuine friendship that transcended species barriers. Jake understood that Zexhai was essentially a refugee who had sacrificed everything to prevent a war, and he was determined to ensure that the alien commander received fair treatment. The intelligence that Zexhai provided proved to be accurate and invaluable. Within days of his arrival, Earth Defense Command began detecting Cytherian scout ships conducting reconnaissance of human colonies exactly as he had predicted. Long-range sensors confirmed the movement of large military formations in Cytherian space, consistent with preparations for a major offensive campaign. The early warning allowed human forces to begin preparations for the coming conflict. Colonies were evacuated from the most vulnerable positions. Defensive installations were reinforced, and the fleet was repositioned to meet the expected attack routes. Without Zexhai's intelligence, the first wave of Cytherian attacks would have caught human forces completely unprepared. Admiral Hayes coordinated the military response while a team of diplomats worked to establish formal communication channels with the Cytherian Republic. The hope was that direct negotiations might prevent the war entirely, or at least delay it long enough for human defenses to be properly prepared. Zexhai provided crucial insights into Cytherian diplomatic protocols and the political factions that might be willing to consider peaceful alternatives. The war, when it finally came, was every bit as brutal as Zexhai had warned. Cytherian forces attacked with overwhelming firepower and tactical sophistication, but they met organized resistance instead of the surprised victims they had expected. Human ships used the intelligence about Cytherian weaknesses to develop new tactics and weapons that proved surprisingly effective against the technologically superior enemy. Zexhai continued to provide assistance throughout the conflict, analyzing Cytherian tactical changes and helping human commanders understand their opponents' decision-making processes. His contributions were invaluable, but they came at a personal cost as he watched members of his own species dying in battles that he had helped humans to win. The turning point came when Zexhai volunteered to make direct contact with moderate factions within the Cytherian military, using his personal relationships and reputation to open channels for negotiation. It was an incredibly dangerous mission that required him to enter Cytherian space under diplomatic protection. Knowing that many of his own people now considered him a traitor worthy of execution, the peace negotiations that followed were complex and difficult, hampered by centuries of mistrust and cultural misunderstanding. But Zexhai's presence at the talks provided a bridge between the two species, someone who understood both human values and Cytherian honor codes. His sacrifice and courage had demonstrated that cooperation was possible even between species that seemed fundamentally incompatible. Jake Morrison and the crew of the New Frontier were honored as heroes for their role in preventing what could have been a devastating war. But Jake always insisted that the real hero was Zexhai, who had given up everything to stand for peace and understanding. The alien commander had proven that moral courage existed in many forms throughout the galaxy, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies but from finding the wisdom to turn them into friends. Years later, as the first permanent diplomatic exchanges were established between Earth and the Cytherian Republic, both species would remember that the path to peace had begun with a simple act of compassion in the cold depths of space. Zexhai became the first Cytherian ambassador to Earth, while Jake Morrison retired from active service to head the new Interspecies Cooperation Commission.